Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is The Giant Dressed in Grey, Chapter 5. Opening of the summer campaign in Virginia. Artillery engagement. The Second Great Battle of Manassas. When the train which we were to take for Gordonsville reached the Hanover Courthouse station on the afternoon of the 16th August, our horses having been already safely placed in a stock car awaiting its arrival, it was so densely crowded with troops, many of them lying stretched out on the tops of the carriages, that the general and staff, not wishing to deprive any of these brave fellows of their seats, determined to ride on the tender of the locomotive where, in the best possible spirits, we made ourselves as comfortable as the circumstances of the case would allow. There is a feeling of great buoyancy in the breast of the soldier when, after a period of unusual inactivity, he goes forward again to the field. One seems to oneself so strong and looks so gaily forward to the coming campaign. Too much occupied with the future to indulge in reveries of the past or regrets for happy hours departed never to return, we filled up the time with talk and song as we rolled rapidly through the beautiful country of which, by reason of the thick clouds of smoke that enveloped us, we could catch only occasional glimpses. We arrived at Gordonsville just at daybreak. When the morning light grew strong enough to enable us to see each other, we broke out at the same moment into a hearty roar of laughter, for it revealed faces as black as Ethiopia. The engine had been covering us with soot from the time we left Hanover Courthouse, and it required many ablutions to restore the natural color of our skins. After an hour's delay thus employed, and partaking of a light breakfast, we proceeded by special train to Orange Courthouse, where we brought up at 11 o'clock in the morning. We now mounted our horses and rode through the numerous encampments of our army to the headquarters of General Robert E. Lee, where we tarried an hour and then proceeded to the camp of Jackson a few miles off, which we reached about 3 p.m., just in time for dinner. The great stone wall gave but little thought to the comforts of life, but he was so much the pet of the people that all the planters and farmers in whose neighborhood he erected his simple tent vied with each other in supplying him abundantly with the delicacies of the table. And accordingly we found an excellent dinner set out, to which we did full justice. Immediately after rising from the repast, General Stuart dispatched Captain Fitzhugh and Lieutenant Dabney of his staff to the little village of Fredericksburg, where he expected the arrival of Fitzlee's brigade, and desired me to accompany himself on a little reconnaissance to Clark's Mountain, where we had erected a signal station, from which, it was said, there was a wide view of the plains of Culpeper, dotted with the encampments of the Federal Army. On our way, we met one of our scouts, Mosby, who had acted as courier to General Stuart and who subsequently so greatly distinguished himself in the guerrilla warfare he conducted. Knowing him well acquainted with the position of the enemy, the general ordered him to ride with us. The view from the summit of Clark's Mountain is indeed magnificent. On the right, the eye ranges over the dark green of the immense forests which line the borders of the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers for many miles, while in front stretches the vast fertile valley of Culpeper, engirdled in a remote landscape by the Blue Ridge, whose mountain tops, thickly wooded, afforded, in their dark blue tint as we saw them, a lovely contrast with the splendor of the evening sky. There were abundant signs of active military life in this valley. Many thousands of tents were to be seen, the thin blue smoke of their campfires rising straight up in the still air. Regiments of infantry were marching and countermarching in various directions, and long wagon trains were moving along the distant roads, escorted by cavalry detachments with gay pennants and guidons. From every indication we were convinced, as we set out on our return, that the enemy was preparing a general movement, probably a retrograde one, and this proved to be the fact. 18th August. It was late in the night when we reached the little village of Fredericksburg, finding there Fitzhugh and Dabney, who reported, to General Stuart's great surprise, that our cavalry had not as yet arrived. Captain Fitzhugh was sent immediately in search of it, while the rest of us bivouacked in the little garden of the first farmhouse on the right of the village. Being so far outside of our lines, we did not unsaddle, taking off only our blankets, and for myself, I observed the precaution of lying down with my weapons, which made Lieutenant Dabney ask me why I would persist in making myself so uncomfortable. But he had reason to regret that he had not the prudence to profit by my example. We slept little during the night and were awake with the dawn. About 4 a.m. we heard the heavy trampling of a long column of cavalry and the rumbling of artillery, and saw through the mist of the morning a strong body of horsemen crossing the road which led through the village about 400 yards distant from us. General Stuart, confidently believing that this was Fitz-Lee's brigade, sent Mosby and the only other courier we had with us to order the command to halt and inform the commanding officer that he wished to see him immediately. A few seconds later, we heard pistol shots in rapid succession and saw our 2 men coming towards us at full run, a whole squadron of the enemy in close pursuit. I stood close to the general, handing him his blankets as the Yankees, not more than 150 yards from us, came rattling along. Stuart, without hat or haversack, jumped into the saddle and, lifting his animal lightly and cleverly over the garden enclosure, gained the open field, after him Dabney, leaving behind him his sword and pistols. I had to run about 15 steps to the place where my horse was tied to the fence, and reaching it, I unfastened the bridle but had no time to throw the reins over his head. The animal became excited and reared and plunged fearfully, and I was obliged to vault upon his back without the rein, a feat which I safely accomplished and afterwards succeeded in forcing him through the garden gate, which was opportunely held open for me by the old lady of the house. Here I came directly upon the major who commanded the detachment, who placed his revolver at my breast and demanded my surrender. But before he or his men could divine my intentions, by a smart slap on my horse's head, I turned it in the right direction, and, putting the spurs deep into his flanks, I extricated myself by a tremendous flying leap from the hostile circle which was rapidly drawing closer and closer around me. A shower of carbine and pistol bullets followed my retreating figure, and the Yankees, enraged by the trick I had played them, dashed after me in hot and furious pursuit. The greater number of my pursuers I soon left far behind me, thanks to the speed of my noble black charger, but a few, and the major foremost among them, were still close upon me. The latter discharged at me 3 barrels of his revolver, one of the bullets passing through my uniform without scratching the skin. After a race of nearly a mile, the Yankees gave up the game, and I was able to get hold of my bridle, having been until then, so far as all management of my horse was concerned, in a perfectly helpless condition. Captain Fitzhugh, who had been taken prisoner by the same troops the previous night while on his way to look after Fitz-Lee's brigade, and who, having given his parole, had been allowed to witness the whole affair, told me afterwards that he could not understand how I ever made my escape, and that at every shot fired by the major he had shut his eyes so that he might not see me fall. Soon after getting clear of my pursuers, I was joined by Mosby, and we rode back some distance to see what had become of our companions. We soon found the general bareheaded, looking at the disappearing column of the enemy, who were carrying off in triumph his beautiful hat, the present of a lady in Baltimore, and his haversack containing some important maps and documents. Dabney made a sorry appearance as he came up without his arms, and I could not help maliciously asking him if he felt quite comfortable now. Stuart covered his head with his handkerchief as a protection against the sun, and we would not look at each other, despite our heat and indignation, without laughing heartily at the figures we respectively cut. The driver of a sutler's wagon belonging to a Georgia regiment whom we fell in with on our return happily supplied General Stuart with a new hat, but the tidings of our mishap and adventure had spread like lightning through the whole army and excited a great sensation. Wherever we passed an encampment on our way, the troops cheered us and vociferously inquired of General Stuart what had become of his hat. Fitz-Lee's brigade, which had been detained by bad roads and a misconception of orders, did not join us until late that night, when Robertson's brigade also arrived on the Rapidan. Hampton's command had been left behind on the lines of the Chickahominy on picket duty. It was a great satisfaction to be with our troops again, and to be assured that an opportunity would soon be afforded us of paying off the Yankees for their recent attention to us. On the morning of the 19th, we marched with General Fitz-Lee's brigade towards the Rapidan, where Robertson's command had encamped. There we bivouacked and made our preparations for the fight, which would in all probability take place on the following day. The army of General Pope had retreated in accordance with our expectations for a considerable distance and taken a new position on the north side of the Rappahannock, leaving a large body of cavalry on our side of the river in the neighborhood of Brandy Station on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. This force we had orders to drive off. 20th August. At daybreak, with 2 brigades, we crossed the Rapidan. The passage was attended with difficulty, especially with the artillery, on account of the depth of the water. Lee's brigade was sent to the right in the direction of Kelly's Ford. General Stuart and staff marched with Robertson's brigade in the direction of Stevensburg, about 1 mile from Brandy Station, and both commands were to unite near the latter place. Our advance guard came first in contact with the enemy, who, broken by the attack, fled in great confusion and were pursued through the little village and more than a mile beyond it. The joy of the inhabitants, who for a long time had seen none but Federal soldiers and who had been very badly treated by them, cannot be described. Men, women, and children came running out of all the houses towards us with loud exclamations of delight, many thanking God on their knees for their deliverance from the enemy. A venerable old lady asked permission to kiss our battle flag, which had been borne throughout so many victorious fights, and blessed it with tears. The enthusiasm was so great that old men and boys, all that were able to carry a gun, in spite of our earnest remonstrances, followed our column to join in the fight with the detested Yankees. The enemy, strongly reinforced, had now taken position about 2 miles from Stevensburg on the outskirts of an extensive wood. Several small detachments had been pushed nearer towards us and were patrolling on our flanks. One of these, in strength about half a squadron, mounted on grey horses, operated with great dash, but, advancing imprudently, was cut off by a body of our men, who fell upon them like a thunderbolt, killing and taking prisoners all but 6, who saved themselves by the fleetness of their horses. The Federals dismounted many of their cavalrymen, and their line of sharpshooters, about a mile in length, poured upon us from the dense undergrowth a heavy fire, wounding several of our men and horses. This checked for a time our onward movement, but a large number of our troops, having been also dismounted, engaged the Federal tirailleurs with great gallantry, and we then charged with the main body upon the enemy's center and quickly drove them from our position. In the melee I captured a very good horse, which was unfortunately wounded very soon afterwards, but I took from it an excellent saddle and bridle that had belonged to an officer. The enemy's retreat was now so rapid it was difficult to keep up with them, so that General Stuart, in order not to exhaust all our horses, took only 1 regiment, the 7th, in the pursuit with him, giving orders to the rest to follow at an easy trot. We were not long in reaching the heights near Brandy Station, from which we saw the Federal cavalry in line of battle in the large open plain before it. They were about 3,500 strong, and being drawn up in beautiful order, presented, with their arms glittering in the sun and their waving battle flags, a splendid spectacle. Our brave fellows of the 7th were immediately placed to confront them, and the sharpshooters of both parties were soon engaged in a brisk skirmish. With great impatience and anxiety we now waited the arrival of our reserves, and courier after courier was sent to hurry them to the spot. As even our color sergeant had to perform orderly duty, I took the battle flag from his hands. This act attracted the attention of the enemy's sharpshooters at a distance of 800 yards, and they kept up, from that remote point, for some time, a surprisingly well-directed fire at me, one of their bullets cutting a new rent in the glorious old ensign. The enemy now commenced his serious attack, and as our position, by reason of his vastly superior numbers, was a precarious one, General Stuart, taking the standard himself, ordered me to gallop in haste to our reserves, assume myself the command, and bring them up as fast as the horses could run. After a short, sharp ride, I reached the regiments and with a loud voice commanded them in the name of their general to move forward at a gallop. As I was well known to every man in the division, the order was at once obeyed, and in a few minutes I arrived with the column at the spot where General Stuart awaited us with the greatest solicitude, just in time to form hurriedly our lines and dash onward with the wild Virginia yell to the rescue of the 7th. Occupying the place of honor in front of the regiments, I shared to the full extent the excitement of the onset. The enemy, as usual, received us with a rattling volley, which emptied several saddles, but a few seconds more, and we were in the midst of them, and their beautiful lines, which we had so much admired, had broken into flight. I had the satisfaction here of saving my life by a magnificent blow upon one of my antagonists, who, at the very moment of firing at me, received my full right cut on the lower part of the neck, severing his head nearly from his body. During the confusion of the melee, I discovered suddenly that a fresh squadron of the enemy was attacking us on the right flank, a maneuver which, in the disorder inevitable after a charge, might have turned out disastrously for us, and, collecting about 80 of our men around me, I threw myself with this comparatively small force upon them. They at once slackened their pace, and when we had got within 40 yards of them, halted and received us with a volley which had very little effect. Upon this they fled precipitately and were chased by us into the woods, where many of them were cut down and made prisoners. The main body of the enemy meanwhile had rallied several times, but again and again they had to yield before our impetuous advance, until the last of them were driven through the waves of the Rappahannock, where their infantry and artillery, strongly posted on the farther bank, offered them protection, leaving behind many of their dead and wounded and several hundred prisoners. I had a happy feeling when riding out of the battle and wiping the blood from my sword on my horse's mane. I was complimented by General Stuart most warmly for my behavior, and to this day it is to me one of the most exciting recollections of the war. The whole had been a genuine cavalry fight, with sabres crossing and single combat, incidents that very rarely occur in modern warfare, reminding me very much of the battle pieces of the Dutch painter Wouvermans. The Yankees gave a most amusing description of me in their newspapers. In their accounts of the fight, it was stated that the rebels in their charge had been led on by a giant, mounted on a tremendous horse and brandishing wildly over his head a sword as long and big as a fence rail, who had made a terrible impression on their troops. Fitz-Lee did not arrive with his brigade on the battlefield until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, having himself had a hard encounter with a strong force of the enemy, which he had succeeded in driving back, taking many prisoners. The rest of the day we were busy in burying the dead and taking care of the wounded. I occupied myself chiefly with nursing Captain Redmond Burke of our staff, who, while charging gallantly by my side, had received a bullet in the leg. We bivouacked on the battlefield, which is now a desert, where the bones of men and animals are bleaching on every hand. Many fights afterwards took place on the same ground, and the place is historic. Future generations of Virginians, as they pick up rusted bits of shell and bullets and fragments of broken weapons, with which the whole field has been so often strewn, will recall with pride the noble deeds done by their fathers in the battles at Brandy Station. 21st August. During the night and early in the morning, a large party of our army had arrived in the vicinity of Brandy Station, and soon after daylight the boom of artillery from Jackson's corps, which was in advance, announced to us that old Stonewall was already at work. General Robert E. Lee had established his headquarters in a grove quite near us, and as we could get nothing for breakfast, we gladly accepted his invitation to share his own frugal meal, which consisted of rye, coffee, bread, and wild honey. Orders were now given us to proceed immediately to the front and cooperate with Jackson in the event of any further extensive operations being attempted. The firing of the morning we soon found to have been nothing more than an artillery duel between some of Jackson's guns and the Federal batteries, from which the latter withdrew after one of their caissons had been exploded. Some infantry and cavalry, which had been posted on the opposite bank of the river, having also disappeared, we received orders to cross the Rappahannock with 2 regiments of horse and a section of rifle pieces and reconnoiter the enemy's position. As the road we had to take was tortuous, leading through several ravines up the hilly country in the other side of the Cunningham's ford, and thus affording the enemy a good opportunity for ambush, I was sent ahead with 60 of our men to gain the heights as quickly as possible and select without delay a favorable position for our guns. This we found readily enough on a commanding hill in the midst of a cornfield, as we met with no resistance and saw only a few squads of cavalry afar off. Riding over the ground where the enemy's batteries had recently been placed, I was surprised at the evidences it presented of the tremendous effects of Jackson's artillery. The spot where the caisson had been blown up was covered with dead and wounded men, and muskets and all sorts of equipment lay around, which had been thrown away by the supporting force. As this had consisted of new levies, the men had been demoralized by our well-directed fire and fled in utter stampede upon the explosion of an ammunition chest in the very midst of them. Among other things, I captured here one of the enemy's large regimental drums, which I presented to one of Jackson's regiments to the delight of every man in it. Scarcely had our rifle pieces been put in position when there came in sight a considerable force of the enemy's cavalry, which was held in check only by the accurate aim and rapid service of our gunners and the bold advance of the 5th Virginia Cavalry under Colonel Rosser on our left. We very soon discovered, however, that just now the enemy was disinclined to allow any further proceedings on our part. Several batteries from different points opened upon us, and a large body of infantry made its appearance, throwing forward a double-quick 2-line of skirmishers in excellent order. The command was at once given for us to retire, and as Colonel Rosser's regiment, by reason of the enemy's rapid advance, had been placed in great danger of being cut off, I was sent to warn him of the peril of his position, leaving him to get out of it as best as he could. I reached Rosser in safety, but to rejoin General Stuart without loss of time, I was compelled to ride back along the same line upon which the enemy's skirmishers had been pushing closer and closer, and where again shot after shot was fired at me. It is not a pleasant experience to serve for so long a distance as a target for practiced marksmen, and to count the chances with every lope of one's horse of getting safely past them. The last 8 or 10 of these tirailleurs were not more than 80 or 100 yards distant from my path, and I could distinctly hear the officer calling out to his men to take a quiet aim and bring that impudent rebel officer down. But they missed me, and the tall stalks of the neighboring cornfield soon concealed me for a time from their view. My troubles, however, were not yet over. On getting inside of the fort, I discovered it to be already occupied by the Yankee cavalry, who immediately observed me and started in pursuit. The sharpshooters being now also again on my track, firing incessantly and yelling like bloodhounds, I had but one way left. So, urging my horse some distance higher up the river and forcing him to a tremendous leap from the high bank into the deep stream, I crossed it swimming, the Yankee bullets like hailstones slashing the water all around me. I was received with great enthusiasm and loud cheering by our own men, who had witnessed the whole scene full of anxiety for my fate. Rosser also reached us safely with his command some hours later, but he had been obliged to cut his way through with the loss of several of his men and 2 of his officers. A heavy cannonade was kept up for the remainder of the day by the enemy's batteries, which took position on the opposite bank of the river and were answered in spirit by Jackson's guns, but little damage was done on either side. The Yankees employed here a shell which, being closed by a peculiar screw, made in its flight a most extraordinary noise, very like the high notes of the mockingbird. This excited the lively merriment of our careless fellows, who greeted every one of these melodious missiles with a loud piping imitation from one wing of our army to the other. 22nd August. The darkness of the night had not yet given way to dawn when we again set out for active operations, with portions of Fitzlee's and Robertson's brigades and our horse artillery numbering about 2,000 men. A strong demonstration was to be made in the direction of Welford's fort on the Rappahannock to divert the attention of the Federals and facilitate the daring raid we were afterwards to undertake. Accordingly, we marched about 5 miles northward, crossed the Hazel River, a tributary of the Rappahannock, and arrived about 8 o'clock at Welford's fort, where the opposite banks of the latter stream were occupied by the Yankees in great numbers. The enemy's artillery was soon engaged in a brisk duel with our 2 batteries of horse artillery, which suffered severely, losing many men and horses in consequence of the superior positions and greater weight of metal of their antagonists. About 10 o'clock, we were relieved by Jackson's batteries and, withdrawing from the field without the knowledge of the enemy, proceeded in rapid trot 8 miles higher up the river to Waterloo Bridge, where we crossed it and continued our march to Warrenton. Late in the evening, we entered this little town and were received by the liveliest demonstrations of joy by the inhabitants. We were now again exactly in the rear of the Federal Army, the right wing of which we had marched round, and our bold design was nothing less than to capture the commander-in-chief and his headquarters, which, as our scouts reported, had been established at Carlet Station, a point on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. After an hour's rest to feed our horses, we left Warrenton behind us, continuing our march with great caution. Night was now rapidly approaching, and the angry clouds which had been gathering in the sky throughout the afternoon soon burst upon us in a tremendous thunderstorm and the heaviest rain I ever witnessed. The narrow roads became in a short time running streams of water, and the little creeks on our route foamed and raged like mountain torrents. But this was the very condition of the elements we could most have desired. The enemy's pickets, in the fury of the storm, indifferent to everything but their own personal comfort, were picked up, one after another, by our advance guard to the last man, and we had thus arrived within the immediate neighborhood of the main body of the enemy, without the least information on their part of our approach. Having been sent back by General Stuart with some orders to the rear of our column, I had on my return a very amusing adventure. In passing one of the farmhouses on the road, my sharp eye discovered behind the curtains of one of the windows a Federal officer who disappeared on my approach. Instantly dismounting, I knocked at the door, ordering it to be opened at once, but instead of this, I heard tables and chairs moved hurriedly against it, which so much provoked me that I threw my whole weight upon the light frame. The door gave way with a loud crash and hurled my Yankee, with all his chair and table fortifications, over upon the floor of the little parlor. Before I could lay hands upon the poor fellow, who, being unarmed and seeing himself at the mercy of so powerful-looking an adversary, had risen from his humiliating position with the drollest expression of extreme terror on his face, a very pretty young woman came out of the adjoining room, bearing a waiter in her hands with a bottle of wine and other refreshments, which she offered me in the most graceful manner possible, placing herself at the same time between me and my victim. Tactics like these were so novel to me that for the moment I quite lost my self-possession, but very soon recovering my wits, I thanked her politely for her hospitality, which I should be very ready to accept after I had done my duty. But approaching again and again my prisoner, I encountered again and again this charming obstacle, so that we played for a good while the juvenile game of fox and goose. The scene of action had in the meantime shifted towards a broad door-like window, which opened upon the garden side, and from the gathering darkness and its proximity to the surrounding forest afforded a very fair opportunity of escape. So, seeing no other way of bringing the interview to a satisfactory conclusion, I leveled my pistol at the officer's breast and said, "Madam, if you cannot bear separation from the enemy of your country, I will leave him with you, but not alive." This had the desired effect. The fair creature abandoned her position, and in the midst of her bitter tears and pathetic appealings, which my sense of duty alone enabled me to resist, I bore my prisoner off. He was a handsome young man, a lieutenant in an infantry regiment, and had contracted an engagement of marriage with his protectress before the war commenced. The rain was still pouring in torrents at 11 p.m. when we came directly upon the Federal encampment, which extended about a mile in length on either side of the railroad. We halted at the distance of about 200 yards to form our long lines and make our dispositions, which we accomplished without attracting the notice of our adversaries in the heavy rain and amid the incessantly rolling thunder. The sound of a single trumpet was the signal for nearly 2,000 horsemen to dash, as they did with loud shouts, upon the utterly paralyzed Yankees, who were cut down and made prisoners before they had recovered from their first astonishment. I myself had instructions to proceed with a select body of men to General Pope's tent, which was pointed out to us by a Negro whom we had captured during the day, and who had been impressed by one of Pope's staff officers as a servant. Unfortunately for us, the commander-in-chief had, for once, this day his headquarters in the saddle, an intention which he had so boastfully announced at the commencement of his campaign and had started a few hours before our arrival on a reconnaissance, so that we found only his private baggage, official papers, horses, etc., etc. I obtained as booty a magnificent field glass, which was afterwards of great service to me. The scene had become, in the meantime, a most exciting one, and the confusion, which is always the consequence of a night attack, had reached its highest point. The Federal troops on the other side of the railroad, which was not so easily accessible, had recovered from their panic and, reinforced by some companies of the so-called buck-tailed rifles, commenced a vigorous fire upon our men, who were scattered all over the field, burning and plundering to their heart's content. In the background, our reserves were actively employed in firing the immense depots and wagon trains and the railway bridge, and the flames, rising from 100 different points at once, reddened the dark cloudy night. It was difficult to recognize friend or foe. Shots fell in every direction, bullets whizzed through the air on all sides. No one knew where to strike a blow or where to level his revolver. No one could be certain whether the man riding at his elbow was Federal or Confederate. Having received orders from General Stuart to cut the telegraph wire, I proceeded with 20 men to the execution of this purpose. But just as we had reached the pole, I saw suddenly, by the vivid illumination of a flash of lightning, a whole company of the enemy drawn lip in line not 15 steps from us. And I had just time to call out to my men to lie down, when a rattling volley sent a shower of bullets over our heads. I galloped back to the general, asking for a squadron to assist me in carrying out his orders. The squadron was immediately granted. Attacking the Federal infantry myself in front, while Colonel Rosser took them in flank, we succeeded in driving them farther back. But they still maintained a rapid fusillade, and to climb the pole and cut the wire was a very dangerous undertaking. A young fellow of not more than 17 volunteered to perform the daring feat, and using my shoulders as a starting point, he ran up the pole with the agility of a squirrel. The wire, severed by a stroke of his saber, was soon dangling on the ground, and the brave boy escaped unhurt, several bullets, however, having struck the pole during his occupation of it. And a bit of a short one today, partly because I still have a few swollen bits in my mouth from my wisdom teeth extraction, and talking still is a bit rough. Apologies. Anyways, we witnessed the Battle of Brandy Station, generally considered the largest cavalry battle on the North American continent of all time. It was initiated with a surprise attack by the Union troops, but repelled by the Confederate cavalry, leading ultimately to a Confederate victory, albeit only a tactical one. Of note is the fact that even though around 20,000 troops partook in the engagement, there were in total only about 110 deaths, the rest being either wounded or captured. Also of note is the fact that Stuart and his horsemen were victims of a surprise attack by the enemy not once but twice, which is exactly the kind of thing cavalry is supposed to avoid. Our author himself only barely managed to escape capture. Sources online call this battle the end of Southern cavalry supremacy, and I can see why. Yet we witness our author again being in the middle of it, partaking in mounted combat and putting his sword to good use. We also witness him capturing a young lieutenant who was having a tete-a-tete with his fiancée, only to be interrupted by the giant in grey completely obliterating the door behind which he sought shelter. And finally, on one of the more interesting things that gets mentioned in passing, our man is tasked with capturing a Union general. He knew where the man's tent was located from intelligence he received from a black servant, and I'm making air quotes here, whom he talked to before. Black servants in the Union Army is something that gets rarely mentioned, yet here we are. I'll let you come up to your own conclusions in this matter. Anyway, the second battle of Manassas is coming up, and we shall find out all about it in the next episode. Cheers.